Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar. And what that basically means is that I have spent a great deal of my life studying the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. So I'm generally speaking the kind of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about his works, whether it's the Hobbit, or the Lord of the Rings, or the Silmarillion, or the Children of Húrin, or the Fall of Gondolin, or the Fall of Númenor, or Beren and Luthien, or the Parma Eldalambran, or any of his other works, really. That there's so many out there, like the History of Middle-earth, the History of the Hobbit, and such, translations, Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, all that stuff. So, if you want to ask me a question, you can do so right in the comments, and that's just fine. I try to answer as many comments as I can. I try at least 2 times a week to go through and read all the comments and sort of like answer as many questions that come through as I can. But if you want to be featured in the video, there's a website called Quora, and that's where I source the material from. So there is a link to my Quora account in the description of this very video and every video that I do. And if you go on Quora and you're on there and you ask any sort of question regarding the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, after you ask the question, you're going to be asked to tag people who are considered experts in their field, which is sort of the whole idea of Quora, and my name is going to be at or near or the top of that list. So if you see me on there, you can do it that way as well. But like I said, there is a link directly there. It's very easy to make an account on Quora, and it's a pretty great site where you can ask any sort of question and have it answered by people with relevant experience. And of course, anybody can answer a question on there, but it is made in a way that the people who can answer the questions accurately are going to be the ones that are going to be sent the questions. And of course, you'll get other answers on questions that you submit on there as well, and you can get sort of a consensus, or maybe you can get a difference of opinion, which is pretty interesting when that happens as well, because there are things in the Legendarium, which is Tolkien's body of work concerning Middle-earth and Arda in general, that are not so cut and dry, and that are, in fact, a matter of opinion. And I think 1 or 2 questions that we're going to get to today are in fact sort of opinion pieces in a way, where somebody would ask, well, what is your opinion of this? Or ask a question that doesn't really have a cut and dry answer, but I can give an educated, we'll say, a hypothesis. So, there is that as well. Quick channel update. We have crested 1,900 subscribers. We're at 1,914, which is absolutely fantastic. We are going to do something a little bit differently once we reach 2K. So we'll talk more about that when it happens. But it is happening rather soon, and that is absolutely fantastic. I also stream on Twitch. I stream every single day. A lot of it is typical video gaming content, but at least twice a month on Thursday nights, I do Tolkien streams. We are doing reading streams once a month where I read Tolkien. We have done The Hobbit, and we are currently on The Fellowship of the Ring. So that is something that we do on some Thursdays. And then on another Thursday night, once a month, we do The Council of Tolkien, which is myself with 2 other Tolkien scholars, Matt Richardson and Sid Kemp. We call ourselves the Council of Tolkien because we're nerds, and that's what nerds do. And we spend a few hours discussing various topics that are on our minds. So there is that. And there's some other content that I've been sort of neglecting on the channel that I want to get back to, such as playing the Hobbit video game and reacting to things like the Hobbit animated feature. There were a lot of things that cropped up that prevented me from doing a whole lot of stuff, but we're sort of moving past that, especially now starting to move past the holidays. So I'll have a little bit more free time to do those sorts of things for you. Anyway, we like to start every video with a reading. And by the way, if you like the video, hit the like button. And if you really like it and you want to see more of this sort of thing, subscribe if you haven't already. A lot of you have, but there are a lot of you that watch the videos that actually aren't subscribed, which is perfectly fine. Maybe you clicked on it and that's not really my cup of tea, and you click off of it, and that's fine too. But if you do like the video and you haven't subscribed already, I'm going to ask you again at the end of the video, because if you've made it to the end of the video, then you must like the video. But anyway, we're going to read from The Return of the King. Now, I very recently read from The Return of the King, but that was the appendix. I wanted to read from the chapter Many Partings. And the reason that I chose this specific part, there's 2 reasons. One is that I feel this chapter in general is sort of forgotten. People remember the climax of The Lord of the Rings, where Frodo destroys the ring, and people will remember the romance between Faramir and Éowyn. They'll remember Aragorn being crowned. They'll remember the wedding, and they'll remember the hobbits returning home to the Shire and finding that it has been sacked by Saruman. And that's, the scouring of the Shire happens. And some people will remember the time spent in Rivendell and with Bilbo and such. But there is a point that a lot of people forget about where they run into Saruman and Wormtongue on the road in a place called Dunland, which is north of Isengard, south of the Shire. And it's essentially the way they would have gone south on the journey to Mordor if they had listened to Boromir, who suggested taking the Gap of Rohan, but that would have brought them very, very close to Isengard, and Saruman had the Crabine, his bird spies out, and there were wargs and such, so they went through Moria instead. And the second reason that I wanted to do this particular part is that it came up in a discussion on Facebook where somebody was talking about Saruman specifically stealing from Merry. And I said that part never really felt good to me. Like, obviously, it's not meant to feel good to you. He's doing something evil in a very petty sense. He's not doing anything grand. He's not furthering his goals. He's just doing something petty. And I've said it many times that Saruman is pettiness to a T. Everything that he does is based on him being petty and him being jealous and him having envy of Gandalf and just being a very extremely petty, jealous person. And we see it, of course, in the scouring of the Shire when they finally find out that he's the one behind the Shire being in such a state. And he tells them quite plainly why he did what he did. And it was just simple revenge based on the fact that he blames the hobbits for basically everything that's gone wrong for him. And he wanted to hurt them the way that he feels that he has been hurt by them. But in this instance of stealing from Merry, and I like Merry as a character. He's the sort of character that I think you appreciate the more and more you read Tolkien, because he embodies a lot of the specific virtues that Tolkien was rather fond of: patience and pity and mercy. And I've spoken about patience, pity, and mercy with the capital letters and what they mean to Tolkien, what they mean to characters like Gandalf, for example, who learned these things from Nienna, one of the Valar. But that's not what this is about. This is about the opposite of that. This is about somebody who has no patience, who has no pity, and certainly has no mercy, picking on Merry for no particular reason, and Merry sort of taking it in stride because he is a really good guy. Merry is such a great guy that he offers something to Saruman that he didn't need to. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this after we read it. So let's go ahead and read this portion of The Return of the King, the chapter being Many Partings. Soon the dwindling company followed the Ison, turned west and rode through the gap into the wastelands beyond. And then they turned northward and passed over the borders of Dunland. The Dunlandings fled and hid themselves, for they were afraid of Elvish folk, though few indeed ever came to their country. But the travellers did not heed them, for they were still a great company and were well provided with all that they needed. And they went on their way at their leisure, setting up their tent when they would. On the 6th day since their parting from the king, they journeyed through a wood climbing down from the hills at the feet of the misty mountains that now marched on the right hand. As they came out again into the open country at sundown, they overtook an old man leaning on a staff, and he was clothed in rags of grey or dirty white, and at his heels went another beggar, slouching and whining. "Well, Saruman," said Gandalf, "where are you going?" "What is that to you?" he answered. "Will you still order my goings, and are you not content with my ruin?" "You know the answer," said Gandalf. "No, and no. But in any case, the time of my labours now draws to an end. The king has taken on the burden. If you had waited at Orthanc, you would have seen him, and he would have shown you wisdom and mercy." "Then all the more reason to have left sooner," said Saruman, "for I desire neither of him. Indeed, if you wish for an answer to your first question, I am seeking a way out of his realm. "Then once more you are going the wrong way," said Gandalf, "and I see no hope in your journey. But will you scorn our help, for we offer it to you?" "To me," said Saruman. "Nay, pray do not smile at me. I prefer your frowns. And as for the lady here, I do not trust her. She always hated me and schemed for your part. I do not doubt that she has brought you this way, to have the pleasure of gloating over my poverty. Had I been warned of your pursuit, I would have denied you the pleasure." "Saruman," said Galadriel, "we have other errands and other cares that seem to us more urgent than hunting for you. Say rather that you are overtaken by good fortune, for now you have a last chance." "If it truly be the last, I am glad," said Saruman, "for I shall be spared the trouble of refusing it again. All my hopes are ruined, but I would not share yours if you have any." For a moment his eyes kindled. "Go," he said. "I do not spend long study on these matters for naught. You have doomed yourself, and you know it. It will afford me some comfort as I wander to think you pulled down your own house when you destroyed mine. And now what ship will bear you across back so wide a sea?" he mocked. "It will be a grey ship and full of ghosts." He laughed, but his voice was cracked and hideous. "Get up, you idiot!" he shouted to the beggar, who had sat down on the ground, and he struck him with his staff. "Turn about! If these fine folk are going our way, then we will take another. Get on, or I'll give you no crust for your supper." The beggar turned and slouched past, whimpering. Poor old Grima, always beaten and cursed. How I hate him. I wish I could leave him." "Then leave him," said Gandalf. But Wormtongue only shot a glance at his bleared eyes, full of terror at Gandalf, and then shuffled quickly past behind Saruman. As the wretched pair passed the company, they came to the hobbits, and Saruman stopped and stared at them. But they looked at him with pity. "So you have come to gloat too, have you, my urchins?" he said. "You don't care what a beggar lacks, do you? For you have all you want, food and fine clothes and the best weed for your pipes. Oh, yes, I know where it comes from. You would not give a pipeful to a beggar, would you?" "I would if I had any," said Frodo. "You can have what I have got left," said Merry, "if you will wait a moment." He got down and searched in his bag at his saddle. Then he handed to Saruman a leather pouch. "Take what is there," he said. "You are welcome to it. It came from the flotsam of Isengard." Mine, yes, and dearly bought," cried Saruman, clutching at the pouch. "This is only a repayment and token, for you took more, I'll be bound. Still, a beggar must be grateful if a thief returns him even a morsel of his own. Well, it will serve you right when you come home, if you find things less good in the South Farthing than you would like. Long may your land be short of leaf." "Thank you," said Merry. "In that case I will have my pouch back, which is not yours, and has journeyed far with me. Wrap the weed in a rag of your own." "One thief deserves another," said Saruman, and turned his back on Merry, and kicked Wormtongue, and went away toward the wood. "Well, I like that," said Pippin. "Thief, indeed. What of our claim for waylaying, wounding, and orc-dragging us through Rohan?" "Ah," said Sam, "and bought," he said. "How, I wonder? And I didn't like the sound of what he said about the South Farthing. It's time we got back." "I'm sure it is," said Frodo. "But we can't go any quicker if we are to see Bilbo. I'm going to Rivendell first, whatever happens." "Yes, I think you'd better do that," said Gandalf. "But alas for Saruman! I fear nothing more can be made of him. He has withered altogether. All the same, I am not sure that Treebeard is right. I fancy he could do some mischief still, in a small, mean way." So, when Gandalf there speaks of Treebeard, if we remember the way that we had last seen Saruman, was when Gandalf came to Orthanc in its ruin, along with Theoden and Legolas and Gimli, and Merry and Pippin were there as well as several of the Rohirrim. And they had their sort of palaver, and this is when he broke Saruman's staff and cast him out of the order of the Istari, which are the wizards, and cast him out of the White Council. And he told him that he would basically, if he had given himself up, he would be free to go. But since he had not done that, and he had scorned Gandalf, he would be confined to Orthanc, and Treebeard was to be his warden. And then Gandalf goes off to help Gondor, and a lot of things happen. A great many things happen. And when they come back to Isengard, they find that it is empty. The answer there, of course, But no one is in Orthanc. Saruman is gone, and Grima Wormtongue is gone. And Gandalf asks Treebeard what had become of Saruman. And Treebeard basically says, well, I got to talking to him, and he seemed like he was sorry, so I let him go, because I'm not really much of a jailer, and I figure he can't really get up to much. And here we see Gandalf saying, Treebeard might have been wrong. I think he can get up to something in a small, mean way. And that is interesting because, Saruman comes off as sort of one of the primary antagonists of the Two Towers. But everything that he did was sort of small and mean. Even if it was grand scale, like sacking the West Fold and attacking the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep, but it was all for a small reason. It was all mean. In his mind, he had this sort of thought that he was trying to get one over on Sauron, and that he was going to fool the Dark Lord into believing that he had turned and that he had joined him, and that at one point, at a later date, he would betray Sauron and usurp him. And of course, Gandalf told him that's foolishness quite earlier. But he never listens to Gandalf. He never listened to anybody other than himself, and that was sort of a big problem with his personality. And here we see he's just small and mean. He's petty. He's insulting them. He's specifically insulting Galadriel. He's insulting the Hobbits. And he sort of asks for pipeweed, but in a very condescending way, and sort of like, oh, I bet you wouldn't give it to me, And Frodo even says, I would if I could, but I don't have anything to give you. And Merry, who's a really stand-up guy, has some. And there's sort of a very funny thread with Merry and the pipeweed. At one point, he asked Aragorn to borrow some because he thought he had none left. He said, I lost my pouch, and my weed is all gone, and would you give me some? And Aragorn kind of told him to take a walk, But he was messing with him because Merry's pouch was right next to him, and as soon as Aragorn had left the room, Pippin was making fun of him, saying it was there the whole time, and Aragorn was having a bit of fun with you. But anyway, Merry's like, here, you could take what's in the pouch, but I want the pouch back. And Saruman is sort of like, well, you stole it from me, and I'll keep it, and since you're a thief, I'm a thief as well, and I'm going to take your pouch from you. And it's so petty, and Merry's sort of just like, okay, well, whatever, and Pippin's like, oh, that's funny, and nobody really reacts to it. Nobody really rises to it. Saruman might be expecting them to chase after him with swords and such, and be forced to give it back. So that in his mind, the idea that they are setting themselves as what he calls the little lordlings, and that they're going to lord over him, he wants that to be proven right. He wants them to sort of come after him, and of course they don't. And even in the Shire, when he's arrested when they come out of Bag End and he's surrounded, he's thinking they're going to imprison me, or they're going to kill me, and it's Frodo who says, let him go. And then he lunges at Frodo with a knife, and then Frodo's still like, no, let him go. I wasn't hurt. It's fine. And he winds up killed by Grima because he's abusing him so much. And then Grima is killed by the hobbits. Not the primary hobbits that we were following, but some hobbit archers that had fought in the Battle of Bywater during the Scouring of the Shire. But anyway, I find this to be, like I said, Saruman is an infuriating character on a lot of levels, and somebody on Facebook had brought up how he was taunting Theoden, and somebody else brought up how he was taunting Galadriel in this scene. And then I said, well, also, somebody else said he had stolen Merry's pouch, and I said, that really bothered me because Merry's such a great guy. And what's interesting is Merry could have just kept his mouth shut. He didn't have to do this, especially considering that Saruman is responsible for a lot of the carnage in Rohan that Merry saw firsthand. And Merry, we have to remember, was a close friend of Theoden. Now, we can't rightly say that Saruman caused Theoden's death. That was more of a Sauron thing with the Witch King and whatnot. But we can say that he added to his misery because Theoden so loved his land, and a lot of it was razed, and there were a lot of innocent people that died, not soldiers, but civilians. And when his Uruk-hai run roughshod over the Westfold, and they killed his son, Theodred, as well. That, we could say, that Saruman is very directly responsible for the death of Theodred, who was to be his heir. And thankfully he has Éomer and Éowyn to be his heirs, and Éomer, of course, becomes the king of Rohan, and Éowyn becomes the princess of Ithilien, further cementing the relationship with Rohan and Gondor. But I'm just bringing up the fact that Theoden and Merry were close, and now Theoden is gone, and his land had been so wounded, and Theoden never got to see the victory that happened because he had died. And so in a way, Merry could have been sitting there thinking to himself, well, to heck with this guy. After all he's done, I'm not giving him anything. And he would have been fine to do that. He's not morally responsible for giving Saruman tobacco. There's certainly no obligation there, but he chooses to do it anyway. And it really bothers Saruman that no matter how much he taunts them, no matter how much he goads them, they're still bigger than him. They're still better than him. Galadriel and Gandalf, and even these little guys, these hobbits that he scorns so much, even as he's addicted to their leaf. So, because it was on my mind this week, and I had this whole conversation over at Facebook, this isn't really relevant to any of the questions that I'm going to be answering in this episode, but I thought it would be a fun reading for a sort of a lesser known chapter in The Return of the King, an interaction that I feel many people forget about, and one that just had been on my mind. But we're going to get to your questions. We have 15 questions to get through this week, so we're going to start right here with the first one. Our first question comes in by the request of Tomislav, who asks, why didn't Tolkien win the Nobel Prize in Literature? So the harsh truth of it for Tolkien at least, is that he wasn't as appreciated in his time as one may believe based on the acclaim that he gets now. During his lifetime, The Hobbit was a fairly well-regarded children's novel, and The Lord of the Rings existed for a time mostly carried by fans of The Hobbit and fans of fantasy literature. Tolkien was respected as a professor, a philologist, and he got plenty of claim for his academic papers, some of which he published, but there were still many others that he could not publish and were only published after his death even. Most people at the time regarded fantasy literature as sort of pulp fiction. The popularity of The Lord of the Rings was eclipsed by The Hobbit until about 10 years after its release, when it found popularity with the new bohemian culture, what were referred to at the time as hippies. After his death and the subsequent release of Unfinished Tales and the Silmarillion, Tolkien was then seen as the genius that we see him as today. He actually was nominated for a Nobel Prize in Literature several times, 4 times in fact. The first time was in 1954, which was an awkward time to do a nomination because The Return of the King wasn't even published. It was in fact delayed due to the whole appendix thing. The nomination was made by Edward Morgan Forster, but at this point they gave the Nobel Prize to Ernest Hemingway. The second time, it was his friend and colleague C.S. Lewis that nominated him for a Nobel Prize. This was in 1961. So The Lord of the Rings had already been out for, about 6 or 7 years, because it came out stretched across 2 years. But he was rejected, and this is the only time that I actually have documentation for the reason that they rejected him. They stated that The Lord of the Rings was second-rate and that it has not in any way measured up to storytelling of the highest quality. That was the exact wording used by the Nobel panel. The Nobel Prize that year went to Ivo Anorich. Tolkien was in good company in not getting a Nobel Prize this year because, Robert Frost was nominated and Graham Greene was nominated. He was nominated 2 more times. In 1967, Gösta Ham nominated him for a Nobel Prize in Literature, but that went to Miguel Ángel Asturias. And then once more in 1969, where Richard Ernest Wycherley nominated him, but the prize went to Samuel Beckett. So really, it was after his death and the publication of the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales that he started to be more respected, and people started to see the Lord of the Rings as literature and not as pulp fiction. There were, of course, people that did see it that way because he was nominated 4 times, but the Nobel Prize panel just didn't see it that way. You know, they could have given him one posthumously, of course, but that just never came to pass either. So he doesn't need it. He's gone, right? And obviously beloved by many people. And I'm sorry for the sound effects you're hearing. That's Slack. I'm in the Quora Slack, and I guess they're typing in there. It's late at night, but you know, Quora never sleeps. Let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in from Raiden Trost, who asks, where did Gandalf go when he died? So he actually briefly left the created world. The image that I'm putting on the screen right now is sort of a basic cosmology of the created world in the early days. Ea is essentially the created world, the universe, as we would say. It contains everything created in the music of the Holy Ones, the Ainulin Dala. Arda is the world, consisting of the planet, also called Arda, or sometimes it's called Ambar, and the surrounding area. The world shown in the image is flat, but this changed in the Second Age, when God, who's called Iluvatar, broke the world and reshaped it, making it round. He also sundered the Undying Lands, which is Aemon and the surrounding islands, from Arda, though they are connected by a ribbon of sea called the Straight Path. When mortals die, they go to Mandos, which is located in the Undying Lands, and then they pass out of Ea entirely into the void by unknown means. If immortals are slain, their spirits also go to Mandos, and with the permission of its guardian, Namo, also sometimes just called Mandos, because elves like to name some of the Valar after the places that they associated them with, they will be reincarnated with new bodies equal to their old ones in every way. Gandalf is a unique circumstance. He is not mortal, he is not immortal, but rather he's an eternal Ainu, an angel. And as such, he cannot really die. However, he has been incarnated into a mortal body, meaning that he's not just wearing a body as clothing, like many of the angels do, but he's actually bound to it. This would mean that there is not really a precedent for his death. We see with Saruman later in the story, who is in the same situation, incarnated into a real body. With Saruman, his spirit rises from his body, but is blown away by a cold wind from the west. He cannot go home to the Undying Lands. He must linger in Middle-earth, and he doesn't pass from the world like a mortal would. He's just sort of stuck. Gandalf was unique in that his spirit was essentially plucked from the world by Iluvatar and brought to the void where the timeless halls are. This is the home of God and the angels who did not enter the created world. He was gone only for a few days before being sent back, uniquely empowered to replace Saruman. He explained it very briefly and vaguely to Aragorn, stating that he walked paths that he will not speak of. Okay, next question. Next question comes in from Michael Heinsohn. I hope I'm saying it right. If Sauron had won, how would the world how would the world he would have created have looked like? It would be Tolkien's worst nightmare of rampant industrialization and a complete and total lack of personal freedoms. Sauron would destroy the trees and nature and every living being that he deemed to be a threat to his order would be eliminated either through being slain or being driven out of Middle-earth. The rest would be his slaves and his thralls. Sauron had a bit of an obsession with order. He was created to love order and dislike chaos, but he came to view freedom as chaotic. Every aspect of life, down to the most minute of details, would be micromanaged by Sauron to ensure complete and total order. And he would see this as good. He doesn't really see himself as the villain. It is not likely that he would ever actually be satisfied. He would enforce more and more crushing restrictions in his vain attempt at his misguided view of order, until there was finally a divine intervention, which would be catastrophically destructive, as it was in the Second Age, when we had the Akalabeth, and as I mentioned earlier, God came and he broke the world and he reshaped the world, and this did not just happen quickly and quietly. It was absolutely devastating. Numenor was destroyed. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Digital Systematic, who asks, what was Sauron reaching for when Isildur cut the ring off? So this is a movie question, and the answer would probably be nothing at all. He wasn't really reaching for anything. He was reaching for the camera. The film depicts Sauron killing Elendil and Gil-galad, and then and breaking Narsil, and reaching out to Isildur, who slashes at Sauron with the jagged hilt of the sword, severing several fingers and separating Sauron from the One Ring. Sauron explodes, Isildur takes the ring, and then Elrond sort of immediately swoops in and brings him to Samath Naur to destroy the ring, which he famously refuses to do so. He's shown floating in a river riddled with arrows, explaining how the ring would later be found by Déagol, a scene which is shown in a later film. So this didn't happen in the book. In the book, Sauron did kill Elendil and Gil-galad, but they also killed him. He is a fallen angel. He cannot actually die. He's not incarnated like the wizards are, but they killed his body, which forces his spirit to retreat, and Isildur used the hilt of the sword to cut one finger off, the one with the ring. He did not travel to Samath Naur. He did have a very calm conversation with Elrond, who advised him that such a thing should be destroyed, and even suggested casting it into the fire. But Isildur thought it as weirgild for the loss of his father Elendil. If you're unfamiliar with the term weirgild, as in like werewolf, for example, it means man, and gild, of course, refers to gold, the price of a man. In other words, he lost his father, he had lost his brother, and he is taking the spoils of war to sort of relieve himself of his woes of having lost family members. He was killed in a similar way to the film, though it was as he stood up after swimming in the river. He was sniped by a single arrow to the neck that killed him. He wasn't like riddled with arrows, and of course the arrow was also poisoned, so even if he had survived being shot in the neck, which was unlikely, the poison would have gotten him. The distinction is important because the scene in the film is what characters in the book imagined may have happened, that he was just shot with arrows as he was swimming, and thus they thought the ring would have been in very deep water and likely washed downstream and possibly washed away to the sea. They did not think to look in the shallower waters where he may have been standing. Saruman thought of this, but by the time that he, started searching that area, the ring was already in Gollum's possession. Anyway, so why change it? And what was Sauron actually reaching for? Obviously, he logically could have done the same thing to Isildur that he had done to all the others. He could have smashed him good with that giant mace that he was carrying. But then, of course, that changes the story. Peter Jackson wanted to depict the human characters differently, showing Isildur was a failure and Aragorn is sort of the corrected version of Isildur. He also wanted an exciting opening scene. Of course, it could have been very exciting to see a fast-paced battle between Sauron and Gil-galad and Elendil. In the book, they fought for days. But the detailed depictions of these battles comes from books that are not the Lord of the Rings, books that Peter Jackson did not have the rights to adapt. So he wished to show Isildur actually fighting, and he had to get the ring somehow. He didn't want to show Isildur triumphing in battle. That would make Sauron seem rather weak in the opening scene. So Isildur wins basically by blind luck. Sauron sort of very stupidly reaches for him instead of his mace. But it's not important if it makes a lot of sense. What's important is what the scene communicates. We see Sauron brought low, and we clearly see the ring on his finger. It's really important to show that. So it's really more of an establishing shot and a way to relieve him of the ring in a way that was going to fit Peter Jackson's narrative. It wasn't Tolkien's narrative, it was Peter Jackson's narrative. And, of course, as the director of the film, he, of course, has the right to tell his narrative, his version of it, and that is a form of, we'll say, artistic license. But what was he actually reaching for? Why would he do that? He was reaching for the camera. That's the only thing I could tell you there. Okay, let's move on to the next question. The next question comes in from Justice Collian, who asks, how would you explain the appeal of Hobbits to modern readers? Oh, this is a good one. I like this one. Have you ever seen these sort of memes where it would show just people and it would say, you know, not a phone in sight, just people living in the moment? Hobbits are basically that to a T. Hobbit life is the idealized life that Tolkien wished for. He described himself as a hobbit in all but height, and one must assume a volume of foot hair. He liked simple foods. He liked a comfortable chair and a book. Hobbits live in a rather agrarian way, but they have comforts. Even the less well-off hobbits, like Sam, for example, they seem to do well for themselves. He's quite happy, Samwise. Living a life where the biggest worry that you have, the biggest decision that you have to make in a day is whether to have a seed cake for second breakfast or to have 2 seed cakes for second breakfast. It doesn't speak of grand adventures of slaying dragons and destroying magic rings and fighting in wars, but think of it this way. Throughout Bilbo's entire ordeal, he kept wishing he was home so he could enjoy sitting by the fire in his chair, you know. He did agree to go mostly to prove his worth, but he didn't exactly enjoy it during the adventure. Frodo went to Mordor out of necessity, not desire, and I would say that he didn't enjoy a single bit of it, and he came out of it completely traumatized. But if we could live like most hobbits, not like the remarkable ones that go on adventures, life would just be better. I'll let Thorin Oakenshield say it. Here's a quote from The Hobbit. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Daniel Rees, who asks, what language did Sauron and Morgoth originally speak in Mordor? Well, there's no indication that Morgoth was ever in Mordor for any length of time. Sauron did not come to Mordor until the Second Age, after Morgoth was gone from the world. We have good reason to believe that Mordor was created by Morgoth, as Tolkien stated in The Peoples of Middle-earth, that Urodruin, that's Mount Doom, was one of his creations. Mordor has that boxy mountain style that Morgoth preferred. The mountain range that surrounds it has pretty much the same exact configuration as Hithlum, which was very near to his fortress Angband, just angled differently. Morgoth likely created Mordor before the Spring of Arda during the First War with the Valar, and they strove to change the land. However, he did not ever establish a fortress or have an actual presence in Mordor. Either way, it is likely that when alone, they spoke Valoran, which was the language of the angels. Of course, Sauron is a Maya spirit, and Morgoth is a Vala spirit. And even as he was cast out of the Order of the Valar, he's still one of them by his nature. In more mixed company, Morgoth was more than capable of speaking any language that was needed. He could speak Quenya, he could speak Sindarin, and the early Mannish tongues, which were based off of Avari. We'll try to talk about that a little bit later as well. Basically, they could speak any language that they needed to. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Peter Eckenkrantz, I hope I'm saying it right, who asks, can elves survive without food? Mathros was hanging from a cliff for 30 years before being rescued. Compared to humans, the resilience of elves must be extraordinary. Are there other examples of elves surviving extreme situations? So elves are essentially human, and they need food. They cannot die of old age. They cannot die of sickness. Dying of hunger is untested. I believe we can examine the situation and come to a logical hypothesis here. The important point here is that elves are human. Many people say human in relation to Tolkien's Legendarium, but the term that Tolkien liked to use is mortal, or possibly just man. And it was really just because those words are Anglo-Saxon and human is a Latin phrase, and he didn't much care for Latin. Tolkien never really used the term human to refer to mortal man, but he insisted the difference between men and elves was not biological or physiological, it was spiritual. This doesn't mean that a total lack of physical differences, but men and elves are essentially the same species. This is proven by the fact that men and elves can not only interbreed with each other, but that their offspring are fertile and can bear children of their own. That being said, there are absolute differences that come from the strong elvish Theia. Theia means soul, and that comes through in their Hroa, which means body. Elves are tougher, they're harder to kill, they heal faster, and they absolutely can go longer without food. In the story, The Fall of Gondolin, we see the difference. Tur, who was later counted amongst the elves, but at this point was a mortal man, and Varanwa are traveling together, and they have very little food, slim rations, and they're really stretching it out. And Varanwa is sort of better off than Tur. Tur is suffering, and Varanwa is not. Elves have a lot of stamina. They don't even really sleep the same way that we do. An example of this is seen in The Two Towers. Legolas sleeps while not only standing up, but pacing back and forth. That being said, it's unreasonable to assume that elves don't need food and they don't need hydration. So we can come up with, say, two main ideas to explain why Mathros, for example, could survive so long chained to a mountain. The first is that Mathros was fed during this period, whether by Morgoth or by one of his servants. Morgoth certainly wished to keep him alive, so feeding him an amount just enough for sustenance would be a reasonable assumption. The other direction we can look at is say that Morgoth kept Mathros alive by other means, a form of necromancy to keep him from dying. Now, we could apply Occam's razor to say that the first explanation, that he was simply given food, is the simplest explanation, and therefore it is the most likely to be true. However, Occam's razor is a scientific device, not a literary device, and the simplest explanation from our point of view may not be the simplest one from Morgoth's perspective. To him, it may be simpler just to cast a necromantic spell on Mathros to prevent his body from dying and leave him in misery. This is why I believe the answer is magic rather than the idea that Morgoth fed his prisoners. To wit, I present the case of Hurin, who was no elf. He was a mortal man, and he was similarly compelled to sit in a chair for decades, for 28 years, on the slopes of Thangorodrim. We know that during this span of time, which is very similar, 30 years, 28 years, that Hurin never left the chair. It's not mentioned that he was ever fed, and from the example given in The Fall of Gondolin, we can assume that he would need to be fed more often than Mathros would have needed to be fed. Of course, you may see that Morgoth was aware of this, and he was sure to do this, but I'm just not seeing it. The main reason is that we already know that magic is involved in this situation. We're told that Hurin is chained and set in slow torment and given magical vision by Morgoth to be able to see the result of the curse on the children of Hurin. We can also make strong surmise that Hurin's body was preserved in some way. Even if he was fed, a man being forced to sit for decades, he, without being allowed to move, would severely atrophy his muscles. He would not be able to move afterwards if he survived at all. No matter how much of a tough guy he is, we need to move. We need to walk. We can't just sit our entire lives. This is why even coma patients are turned and exercised by nurses. After decades, Hurin wouldn't be able to walk again. His skin would be just coming off of his body. He would be beyond madness and in pain, and he probably would have just died. Morgoth released Hurin, who was healthy enough to travel to Hithlum, which is not a very welcoming environment. It's sort of like the snowy version of Mordor, as I mentioned earlier, and across the Ekorioth to near Gondolin. He traveled all over the place. He buried his wife. He slew Mim. Not the actions of a man who sat down for 28 years in torment, unless we believe that Morgoth not only fed him, and fed him well, but kept him hydrated and gave him regular exercise breaks. Magic was absolutely involved, and considering the nature of the vision that he was given of his children's fate, it was already involved. So I would conclude that it is most likely that Mathros was kept alive via magic. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here is a question that comes in by the request of somebody who goes by the name Elemental Sorcerer, Warrior, and Scholar. I love the name, and I love this question, by the way. This is a really great question. Who is more intelligent and knowledgeable between Bilbo Baggins and Frodo Baggins from The Lord of the Rings? They are both 50 years old, the age when they both set out from the Shire on their respective quests and adventure. So we're comparing 50-year-old Bilbo to 50-year-old Frodo in terms of wisdom and knowledge. It's a really interesting question. I love this. I would say, though, that there's not really a comparison here. It's absolutely Frodo. He's the wiser one. In The Lord of the Rings, you may say that Bilbo has the far greater breadth of knowledge and wisdom, especially knowledge. He did, after all, translate the entire Silmarillion himself. He even chides Frodo at one point for not knowing what Dunedain means, stating something along the lines of, I thought I told you enough Elvish that you would know what that means. However, this is Bilbo at 128 years old saying this, not 50-year-old Bilbo. 50-year-old Bilbo was a bit of a ditz. The advantage that Frodo has here at 50 compared to Bilbo at 50 is that he has 21 years of Bilbo educating him. Bilbo's quest happens due to his own internal warring nature, the sensible Baggins and the fiery Took. He had a heart and a desire for adventure, but enough sensible, book-learned, aristocratic background to temper this. He's basically like if Merry and Pippin were fused together. That being said, Frodo is more related to the Brandybucks than the Tooks, making him more of like a fusion between Merry and Bilbo. He's much more thoughtful and put together. He's like Bilbo in a lot of ways, but mostly because he spent so much of his time living with Bilbo from the age of 12 to the age of 33, which are his formative years. He's possibly the most educated hobbit outside of elder Bilbo himself, just lacking life experience. Of course, in terms of wisdom, he has a ways to go. But this is because he hasn't been through anything yet. He comments to Gandalf, for example, that it was a pity that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance, but not understanding his elder cousin's mercy. Gandalf correctly states, "You have not seen him," referring to Gollum, and Frodo brushes this off in stride, but later he states to Sam that he does now pity Gollum, and he repeats a version of Gandalf's words, "I have seen him." Some lessons cannot be taught by books or the passing of knowledge. Of course, we're comparing pre-adventure Frodo to mid-adventure Bilbo, which is unfair. But if their roles were reversed and Bilbo had heard of such a creature as Gollum before going off on his adventure, he may have stated that the right thing to do would be not to involve yourself in such things. He would not examine the moral implications or have any sort of debate with Gandalf. He would just wonder aloud why one would find oneself in a cave under the misty mountains when there are seed cakes and cheese to eat. So, yeah, a 50-year-old Bilbo, before his adventure, a bit of a ditz, I think, a bit of a scatterbrain. Frodo, because of the elder Bilbo raising him, and because he had been through some things, not outside of the Shire, but his parents had died, and he had lived in a few different places. He lived with his parents, he was 2 years old when they passed, but he lived in Brandybuck Hall, and then he lived in Bag End. So even within just the Shire, he was more well-traveled than Bilbo was at that age. So I would definitely say Frodo, but I love the question. All right, let's move on to the next one. Here's a quick one that comes in from, oh my god, I hope I'm not going to butcher your name. Kyriakos Sarantopoulos? I hope I said it right. And this person asks, why did Saruman and his Uruk-hai attack Rohan instead of Gondor? So this is sort of the inverse of a question that I get a lot, which is why doesn't Sauron attack Rohan? And that question never goes away. This is the inverse question, but it's the same answer. Geography is the answer. So the image you're seeing is a map that demonstrates why Saruman would not do something as silly as attacking Gondor. The red circle that you see is where Saruman is in Isengard. The yellow circle is Helm's Deep, where and Edoras, which is the capital of Rohan, is just slightly east by southeast from there. The blue circle, which is much further away, is Minas Tirith, where he would have to fight Gondor. Note the choke point between the mountain and the river there as well, and the fact that he would have to go through Rohan to get to Minas Tirith. The alternative would be going the much longer route through the Gap of Rohan, far to the west, and then the south, and then the east, through the entirety of Gondor, fording rivers and avoiding mountains. It would be really bad, so that's why. And having the map up and talking about all this cartography stuff makes me realize that I meant to show you a gift that I had gotten at the intro here, and I neglected to do that, so I'm going to have to make that wait for next episode. I'll show it off. It's a wonderful atlas of Middle-earth that I got, but I'll show you guys that next week. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Brad Dickerson, who asks, why did Bilbo Baggins never get married? He didn't want to, and he likely wouldn't be able to find a spouse, even if he did. Bilbo was unlikely to find himself a wife, even if he was interested. The end of The Hobbit spells this out pretty plainly. I'm going to read you a little brief bit of The Hobbit. Indeed, Bilbo found that he had lost more than spoons. He had lost his reputation. It is true that forever after he remained an elf friend, and had the honor of dwarves, wizards, and all such folk as ever passed that way. But he was no longer quite respectable. He was, in fact, held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side, but even they were not encouraged in their friendship by their elders. I am sorry to say that he did not mind. He was quite content, and the sound of the kettle on his hearth was ever more musical than it had ever been in the quiet days before the unexpected party. His sword he hung over the mantelpiece. His coat of mail was arranged on a stand in the hall until he lent it to a museum. His gold and silver was largely spent in presents, both useful and extravagant, which to a certain extent accounts for the affection of his nephews and his nieces. His magic ring he kept a great secret, for he chiefly used it when unpleasant callers came. He took to writing poetry and visiting the elves, and though many shook their heads and touched their foreheads and said, "Poor old Baggins," and though few believed any of his tales, he remained very happy to the end of his days. Those were extraordinarily long. So we're told pretty directly that going on his adventure, on top of the fact that he had vanished without warning, and coming back a year later and having been declared dead, and with riches that he returned with, and that he said was from a dragon, the Shire folk thought that he was quite mad. He did have some popularity within his own family, but he wasn't exactly seen as a catch as he may have been before. And keep in mind that the Shire folk already thought he was a bit of a weirdo before he left. In another story, The Quest for Erebor, Gandalf notes that his visit to Bilbo at the start of The Hobbit was not his first attempt. He had come a few days earlier, only to be told by an incredulous hobbit that Bilbo was off seeking elves. Bilbo celebrated the Elvish New Year, and oftentimes they would travel to Lindon through the Shire and its surrounding lands, and Bilbo would go off hoping to meet elves. It's made quite clear to Gandalf that this is the action of a deeply troubled mind, and the general opinion of the populace is that he's strange. So, in this same story, The Quest for Erebor, Gandalf himself admits that he wondered himself why Bilbo never married. And he has several theories as to why, but the prevailing one is that Bilbo never wished to be tied down to a family. He wanted his independence. And if the mood struck him to suddenly be off, he could do so without having the responsibility of a spouse or children. As stated in The Hobbit, he didn't mind the general stigma that he faced. He was content enough to be left alone by hobbits, but he still had plenty of guests, mostly his cousins and his younger nieces and nephews, but also those from outside the Shire. Dwarves and Gandalf and elves were coming by, and a lot of the hobbits, they didn't like that. So even if he was interested in a wife, I don't think he would have found one, not in Hobbitons, certainly. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Victorinox Rush, who asks, why aren't the dwarves' eyes adapted to the dark in the caves where they live in The Lord of the Rings? Why do they need candles? So I think you're misunderstanding how eyes work a bit, and definitely misunderstanding how dwarves live. Let's examine a few facts about dwarves. Not all of them live underground. Those that do live underground did not spend the entirety of their lives underground, and the largest subterranean dwarf colony, which was Khazad-dûm, also called Moria, accepted guests who were not dwarves. It should also be said that eyes just don't work like that. If you're in a very dark room, and you stay there for a very long time, you will eventually adapt to the low light situation, and you'll be able to see better. It doesn't make you a cat. You do not have perfect night vision. You may start off by not even being able to see your hand in front of your face, and eventually be able to see well enough to move around the room without tripping over something or walking into a wall. This doesn't mean that you can do things like read a book or write something or make delicate crafts that require precision, things that dwarves did all the time. Adding to this, something as deep as the mines of Moria, found even below the city, would not be a low-light situation, but a no-light situation. Your eyes need light to see, and they can adapt to very little light, but you can't see with no light at all. And even if what you're sort of imagining here is true, that would mean that as soon as they stepped out of their city into the open air, even starlight would be absolutely blinding to them. The moon would be like a laser beam in their eyes. The sun would completely blind them. This wouldn't be a problem with things like trading. This would be a problem, I'm sorry. It would be a major problem for them with trading with other races, which we know that they do. Thorin, for example, stated that they traded with men a lot for food because they couldn't be bothered to grow their own food or find their own food, but they would make armor and weapons, and they would teach their crafts to men, and that's how they got their food. But in The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship goes through a door into Moria that has an inscription written in Sindarin. And you may ask, why would a door to a dwarven settlement have an elvish instruction on how to open it? And the answer is simple. This door once faced Regin, also called Hallan, which was a colony of Lindon led by Lord Celebrimbor, who was a great friend to the dwarves. Gandalf explains that the doors once stood open with only wardens there guarding it, and they were not sentries to keep people out, but to welcome people in. This was, for all intents and purposes, the elvish entrance to Moria. If Moria didn't have light, then how were the elves supposed to see? And don't give me any of that about, oh, they have supernatural sight and whatnot. They need light to see. We have reason to believe that Legolas probably had amazing night vision because he lives in Mirkwood, which was pretty dark. But Bilbo's description of the subterranean palace of Thranduil was that it was well lit. Elves generally liked nighttime. The L in elf, the EL, and Eldar, it refers to the stars. But they need light. Once the great lamps that lit Middle-earth were broken by Melkor, Varda made extra stars so that they could see. Moria wasn't a clubhouse, it was a city, and they had visitors who were elves, they had visitors who were men and such. Keeping it fully dark all the time would make this impossible, and it would make their way of life impossible. The dwarves needed light too. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here's a question that comes in from Daniel Cuneo, who asks, were the Third Age or Second Age Easterlings and the First Age Easterlings related or akin in Middle-earth? No, not at all, really. Only in the way that all people are related. Easterling is sort of a catch-all term that means man from the east, and of course, who is an Easterling would depend on where you are. This is similar to Haradrim, which means man from the south in the Lord of the Rings. The Hobbits and the men of Bree, such as Barlaman, refer to several Southerners in the Prancing Pony, revealed much later to be in the employ of Saruman, and some of them are half-orcs. Later, we get the term Southron, which is used interchangeably with Haradrim. Either way, the Easterlings of the First Age, such as those in wolfskins mentioned in the Children of Húrin, who were allied with Morgoth. They were from the east, but these stories took place in Beleriand and to a much lesser extent in Eriador. So Easterling, in this sense, refers to east of the Misty Mountains. And the Third Age term for folks from those sort of parts would be Wilderman or simply men from Rovanion. Considering the migrations that happened, the Easterlings in the Silmarillion would have more in common with the Rohirrim, who later, they were the Eotheir at first, and they went down to Calanarthon, and they were given that piece of Gondor. It became Rohan, and they became known as the Rohirrim. So they would have more in common with those people than the Easterlings in the Lord of the Rings, who were from further east, Rhûn, which literally means east. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Lewis Matthews, who asks, if Sauron wore the One Ring, would he be capable of fighting any of the Valar? Well, capable of fighting is different from capable of winning. I would say he was capable of fighting anybody that he wanted to. That doesn't mean he could get very far with that. But no, in understanding this to me that he would actually be able to put up a fight and have meaningful combat with any of the Valar, no, absolutely not. Not even Nessa the Swift, who was considered the least of the Valar. Nessa is described in the Silmarillion as the least powerful of the Valar. She is known pretty much just for one thing, and that she could run very fast. That's not to say that she wouldn't absolutely embarrass Sauron if they fought. She's still a Vala, and the word Vala literally means power. That isn't to say that a Maya can never best a Vala. The greatest of the Maiar was Eanwa, and he defeated Morgoth. However, at this point, Morgoth's very weakened. He was unvaliant in battle, and Eanwa was specifically mentioned to be the greatest fighter in the world when it came to weapons. Sauron is mentioned to be the greatest in terms of magic, but when it comes to a physical fight, whether or not he has the ring, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't put him anywhere near the level of the Valar. When Sauron had the ring on his finger, he was defeated by Elendil and Gil-galad, a man and an elf. Now, we're talking about one of the greatest men and one of the greatest elves of their time, and they died too. But they are still nowhere near the level of the Valar. The fact is, Sauron is too smart to fight the Valar. In the Third Age, if he had regained the ring, he would be stronger, but more importantly, his enemies would be a lot weaker, referring specifically to Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf, because they would be forced to remove their rings of power. He was still winning the war without the ring. He was separated from it physically, but not spiritually. But the physical separation gave his enemies the opportunity to possibly destroy it and make him weak. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Jeffrey Charles Ockley, who asks, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote the Silmarillion. How many times did he try to write it before he gave up on it? So he never really gave up on writing the Silmarillion, though. At one point, he seemed to give up on the idea that it would be published. The Silmarillion is not really a novel in the sense that it does not tell one single story with a narrative flow, but rather a chronicle, a fictional history of Middle-earth from the creation myth up through the fall of Sauron at the end of the Third Age. The idea was that the Silmarillion would be the outline of the legendarium, and he would take certain tales from it which he called the Great Tales, that would be written in full, and some would not be written in full, but they would be left for others to finish or to flesh out. The Lord of the Rings, for example, is the fleshed out version of the final chapter of the Silmarillion, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. The Silmarillion was Tolkien's life's work. It contains versions of the stories that were some of the first that he ever wrote about Middle-earth, such as the Children of Húrin and Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin. Early versions of these were written as he recuperated from trench fever after World War I. He initially wished to publish it along with The Lord of the Rings. He called the entire thing the Saga of the Three Jewels and the Rings of Power. But his publisher rejected the Silmarillion. They wanted only the portion of the saga that was a sequel to The Hobbit, which was initially written as unconnected to the Silmarillion, though it has references to it. If you go to my my videos of my readings of The Hobbit, you can see where I point out a lot of the references to The Hobbit, and not just mentioning Gondolin. There's one part that almost explains the entire history of the elves in a single little paragraph. He never gave up. He wrote and he rewrote and he tinkered and he mixed and he matched, and the Children of Húrin is the most complete tale. Others were left unfinished. The published version of the Silmarillion is made from a lot of different drafts. Some of them are older, some of them were newer at the time, and it was edited together by his son the best he could, with only some minor issues cropping up that were addressed later. It's impossible to say how many times he started over, because his ideas were ever changing and constantly evolving. Even close to his death, he was considering another full revision, which he thankfully never went through, because some of the ideas that he had were very, very sort of taking the fantasy out of it and making it a bit more mundane. And I think he would have eventually decided not to do that, just as for the same reason that he decided not to finish writing The New Shadow, which was going to be the sequel to The Lord of the Rings, and he abandoned that because it wasn't very fantastical. Anyway, let's move on to the final question. Our final question comes in from Francis Corden, and I made reference to this earlier. What became of the original Avari? So the Avari experienced diaspora. They were shunned by other elves, and their numbers just dwindled. The Avari were the refusers. They were the original elves that chose not to take the great journey to Aemon. This doesn't mean that all elves who didn't make it to the Undying Lands were Avari, because some of them started the journey but did not complete it, such as the Sindar. But the Avari were the ones that never started the journey. As the elves first came out of Cuithienin, the Avari did not move out of this area initially, but they didn't stay there forever. They spread out through Middle-earth. Some of them made it over the Misty Mountains, and some even made it as far as Beleriand. They mixed somewhat with the Nandor elves, but they were shunned by the Sindar. The Sindar would not allow any Avari into their settlements. Many of them kept to small, secret groups living in forests and caves. Most of the information pertaining to this is from only the First Age, and it's found in the book The War of the Jewels. And from the Silmarillion, we also learn that those Avari that were closer to their initial home taught the aftercomers, the mortal men, their language, which evolved into the Mannish tongues in following ages. So while the elves that were starting the Great Journey, they developed, they had their primitive Quendian that evolved into Quenya and Sindarin and Telerin. The Avari had their own language, and they taught that to men, and then this became the later languages like Adonaic and Westron and such. But what happened to them after the First Age, we may ask? What happened to the Avari that survived the ruin of Beleriand, or those that were in Beleriand? What became of them? We don't really know. Cuithienin was one of the lands that ceased to exist during the Second Age due to the Akalabeth. Though this doesn't mean that they died, it just means that this particular land was no longer there. We may surmise that any Avari still around that area are kicking around in secret enclaves in the east, in Rhûn. There was a note in the 17th edition of Parma Eldalamberan, which was a language journal, that noted that in the Third Age, not a single Avar was found west of the Misty Mountains. This tells us that any that were left in Eriador had either been slain and were therefore in the Undying Lands, or they had migrated to the east and lived in Rhovanion or in Rhûn, or possibly in the south, but probably not in the south, because there weren't a whole lot of elves left there. The last of them, were sort of in Lothlorien, and Dol Amroth no longer had any elves. The havens there were abandoned. So there we have it. So yeah, the answer is really we don't really know what became of the Avari, but they're still probably just out there in little tiny groups spread out. They don't really have a grander culture. Anyway, thank you guys for watching the video. If you made it all this way and you haven't subscribed yet, this is the time. You've really got to click that subscribe button and that pesky bell that comes with it. It's like a subscribe a second time, I guess. I never really understood the concept of the bell, but it's not enough to just click subscribe. You got to click the bell as well. And if you like the video, hit the thumbs up button, because that helps with the algorithm and such. Leave a comment. Even if you don't have a question, just let me know what you thought. Leave me a comment. Sometimes I get these comments that say just algorithm comment, and I'll respond like, and my axe, because I get what people are doing there, and I appreciate it a lot. They don't have anything particular to say, but they want to help me out. You don't have to put algorithm comment. You can put a line from the Lord of the Rings, or just say hi or whatever, but leave some comments as well. I do enjoy reading them. I will see you guys next week. If you also really, really enjoy it and you really want to support me in a more meaningful way, consider membership. There is a link to in the description to joining. There's also a join button, but some people tell me it doesn't always actually work properly. They click on it and nothing happens. Joining as a member, it is a paid thing. You get a few perks. You get to see all the videos early. That's the major perk. There's also some emotes involved and such. So keep that in mind. You don't have to do it. It's totally cool if you just want to watch the videos. If you watch the videos and you let the ads play, you're supporting me. Or if you watch the videos while you have YouTube Premium, that's totally cool too, because that helps me out too. I will see you guys next time.